Hello, welcome to this week's reflections on the Revelation to John. And let me just pause a moment and say, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button below the video on YouTube. And also, if this has been helpful to you, give me a thumbs up. There's some method in which that helps us reach out to more people on the YouTube programs. I don't know how it works, but I'm not the tech guy, I'm the Bible guy. So we left off, we had covered last week chapter 20, verses 1 through 6, in which John sees a vision about the first resurrection, and later, which it implies, well, if it's a first resurrection, there must be a second resurrection. But later we don't hear about a second resurrection, or we don't read about a second resurrection. Instead, we read only about a second death, or the lake of fire, in verses 14 through 15. And we'll get to that part a little bit more in detail today. But at this point, we're going to pick up with chapter 20, verse 7, and go through verse 10 to begin with. And this is talking about the release of Satan from the abyss. So having seen the vindication of the martyrs, which again, I remind you, martyr doesn't necessarily mean dead. It means those who have remained faithful throughout, which could include death, but it doesn't have to be death, okay? We've kind of turned martyr into somebody that died, but that wasn't the original intent or the translation of the meaning. So we could say, having seen the vindication of the faithful, John now picks up where he left off in verse 3. At the end of the 1,000 years, Satan, no longer disguised as a dragon, is released from his prison, the abyss, to do what he did before, and that is to deceive the nations of the world, according to verse 8. This time, the dragon, or Satan, has no beasts or evil Babylon to help him. He's kind of on his own, which doesn't make him weak by any stretch of the imagination. The nations he deceives are given little known foreign names out of the biblical past: Gog and Magog. You can read about them on your own in the prophet Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39. In Ezekiel's visions, Gog is a person from a land called Magog. Gog was an evil prince. He was said to be the chief of Meshech and Tubal, while Magog was the land from which he came, according to Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 2. Here, both words seem to denote lands or nations. So it gets kind of confusing because they're not used literally here to talk about Gog, the person, or Magog, the region. They're figurative in that sense. So there's no literal. So for those who see a literal millennial, the 1,000 years, or those who see no literal millennial, amillennialism, the 1,000 years, not existing. So those would look at this passage regarding Satan's deception of Gog and Magog as simply the retelling of events leading up to the Battle of Armageddon in chapters 16 and 19. They point to the similarities between verse 8 here in chapter 20, to gather them for battle, and similar language in chapter 16, verse 14, to gather them up for battle, or chapter 19, verse 19, gathered together to make war. Although there's an absence in this chapter of the beast and the false prophet, and that's crucial. Okay, you can't say, well, he's just retelling the same story from these two previous chapters when it's not the same story at all. It's a different story. To John, it's not the case. Okay, it's not the same story being told twice. It's a history repeating itself, perhaps, like We might see something happen today and think, oh, that reminds me of, well, it's not retelling the same battle back then. It's just saying there's a lot of similarity. So the repetition does not have the same immediacy here for John or the reader that the conflict of the beast and the false prophet had. The obscure names of Gog and Magog give the reader a sense of distance, maybe remoteness, perhaps even a sense of unreality. One commentator wrote, when Gog and Magog's armies are destroyed, John's emotional attitude toward that would be very much like that of a modern reader of science fiction who can contemplate with equanimity the liquidation of Mars men with a ray gun, because they do not belong to our ordered structure of human existence. So like the four earthly winds of an earlier vision, they come from the four corners of the earth, which in John's time was just like saying they're from some outlandish territory beyond the bounds of civilization. The four corners of the earth. Like, well, where is that? Well, yeah, it's just out there. So the brief outbreak of evil at the end of the 1,000 years is John's way of saying that Satan's activity is not limited to the immediate threat to the Christians from the Roman Empire in his own time. It can happen at any time and under a variety of circumstances. Still, the outcome is always the same. Satan is always defeated, whether thrown down from heaven, as we saw in chapter 12, verse 9, bound in the abyss, according to chapter 20, verses 1 through 3, or thrown into the lake of fire, as we see in verse 10. Although the battle, in verse 9, is not Armageddon, it is like it in one important respect. Like Armageddon, it's not a real battle at all. When the armies marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves, the outcome was that fire came down from heaven and devoured them. Okay, nobody from the saints or the faithful went out and made war with these people on people. The city he loves, probably Jerusalem in the minds of the hearers, is protected again. And presumably the reign of the martyred saints continues, the faithful continues. And we can see this mentioned again in chapter 22, verse 5, and they will reign forever and ever. After the armies of the nations are destroyed, Satan himself is thrown into the lake of fire, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown into. So see verse 10, but see also go back to chapter 19, verse 20. So again, John makes it clear that he's not just retelling the story of the defeat of the beast and the false prophet at the Battle of Armageddon. The beast and the false prophet are already in the lake of fire. This is another conflict 1,000 years later, even though the result is going to be the same for the dragon and for the dragon's armies, or Satan. The powers of evil were introduced one by one. First, the dragon, chapter 12, then the two beasts, chapter 13, then Babylon the prostitute, chapters 14 through 16. Now they have disappeared one by one, yet in reverse order. First Babylon, chapter 17, verse 1 through chapter 19, verse 10, and then the two beasts, chapter 19, verses 11 through 21. Finally, the dragon, or Satan, chapter 20, verses 1 through 10. So the battles are over. The stage is now set for the creation of a new world. In John's visions, the world goes on for 1,000 more years after the coming of Christ. Yet the prophet seems to know nothing about what the world will be like. His millennium simply provides a cushion of sorts between the demise of the Roman Empire, which threatened the Christian church in his own day, and the end of the world. This is appropriate because the Roman Empire did in fact pass from the scene many centuries ago, and yet world history continued with new tyrannies and new threats to the people of God from outside the church and, frankly, from within the church. The church's conflict with the beast and the false prophet and evil Babylon is the forerunner of conflicts to be continued with institutional authority in the countless times and in countless places since the first century. And if the story repeats itself once in Revelation 20 in the deception of Gog and Magog, it has also repeated itself again and again in actual history. In other words, Satan still deceives the world. Satan has not yet been cast into the lake of fire. In short, a careful reading of the book of Revelation from where we sit today, year 2025, if we think in terms of a literal 1,000 years, that places us 25 years into the third millennium. It suggests an interpretation that this is premillennial because that is what John saw in his visions, although not completely literal because Christ did not literally return and dead martyrs were not literally raised to life when the Roman Empire came to an end. So you can see how this is all apocalyptic, if you will, which doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world. It just means it's written in a kind of a code. It's written so that the readers, the hearers, rather, in the congregations John writes to, will understand there's a symbolism here that Christians need to understand, but not take literally and try to figure out when the end of the world is coming. So continuing on, we're going to look at a larger section, chapter 20, verse 11 through chapter 21, verse 8. And remember, we put the chapter numbers in, humans, a century or so ago. John didn't do it. So when you look and say, when I say things like chapter 20, verse 11 through 21, verse 8, you might think, well, why did John do it that way? Why did he break it up that way? He didn't. He just wrote. So, chapter 20, verse 11, the judgment of old creation. Nature, earth, the world is taking a beating. It's been taking a beating in the book of Revelation. We need only remember the terrible judgments on earth, sky, sea, and fresh water in chapters 8 and chapter 16. In the present passage, we find that her troubles are not yet over. People customarily refer to this great white throne judgment as the judgment on humankind, specifically on those who do not believe in Jesus, although John describes it, first of all, as a judgment on the natural world, the earth and the heaven, according to verse 11. And after that, on the dead, great and small, who inhabited the world and who at the end of it were buried within it, verses 12 through 15. So as soon as we see the great white throne on him and him who is seated on it, we're told that the earth and sky fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. Verse 11. John's language anticipates that of chapter 21, verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Ironically, movements that today we call today call themselves the New Age, or maybe that's even passed us by. But the ones that are clinging nostalgically to an old natural order that is passing away, you can compare some of these writings. You could read them on your own, perhaps. I can't remember if I put them in the resources anyway. But Hebrews chapter 1, verses 10 to 12, 1 Corinthians 7, 31, 2 Corinthians 4, 18, 1 John 2, 15 to 17. Check the resources, they might be there. I'm old, folks. I don't have the best memory anymore. So there's a Greek word that is oranos, and it can be translated either as heaven or sky. When in doubt, most English versions prefer the translation heaven. It makes no sense, however, to claim that heaven, in the sense of God's dwelling place, will disappear at the last judgment. I mean, does it really? If God dwells in heaven and heaven disappears, what happened to God? The NIV uses earth and sky, fled from his presence. Therefore, it's kind of a better translation here. I hate to knock on the NRSV, but I'm going to go with earth and sky rather than earth and heaven, just because it makes better sense to me. And John refers here to the visible world around him, the earth and the sky he could see from Patmos, the island on which he was exiled. He can see these with his own eyes. So John goes on to describe a universal judgment on the dead, great and small, in verse 12. So first nature, then the dead, great and small. And in this case, these dead must be the rest of the dead, mentioned in verse 5, who did not come alive to reign with Christ in the first resurrection. Consequently, they are not blessed and holy, and not necessarily immune to the second death mentioned in verse 6. After books are opened, and above all the book of life, the dead are judged according to what they have done as recorded in the books, verse 12. As to the distinction between the plural books or scrolls, not mentioned before in Revelation, but you can see something like that in Daniel 7, verse 10, and the singular book of life, you can see mentioned in Revelation chapter 3, verse 5, chapter 13, verse 8, chapter 17, verse 8, and chapter 21, verse 27, which we'll come to later. Well, things are not quite that simple. Surprise! We're talking about Revelation here. Revelation 13, verse 8, and 17, verse 8 both talk about every name that was written from the creation of the world. So salvation to John is by divine election, grounded in the mystery of God's grace. At the same time, salvation is the outcome, if not the reward, of good works. I know your deeds, and this can be seen in chapter 2, verses 2 and 5, 19, 23, and 26. Chapter 3, verse 1, 8, and 15. For the deeds will follow them, it says. And in chapter 14, verse 12. So there's a mix here of grace and works. And you can see some of that in Paul's writing in the book of Ephesians, chapter 2. So John made no attempt to reconcile these two apparently conflicting ideas. Is it grace or is it works? And John is saying yes. And I think Paul would have said, yeah. From God's grace leads us into good works. John makes no attempt to reconcile those two because, like most apocalyptic writers, he didn't see any conflict between the two. We're the ones that create the conflict when we try to read these things from our 21st century Western civilization mindset and theology into a book that was written by an apostle who lived in the first century in an Eastern civilization. It's just really hard for us to fathom because we can't think like John thought. And as I said, it was Paul who taught us to see the conflict And Paul's classic solution was that good works are the outcome of the evidence of divine grace. Is the solution most Christians have adopted? Most mainline Christians. And the one John probably would have adopted too, and had there been a problem for him, he would have said, well, Paul wrote, maybe he knew what Paul wrote, maybe he didn't. But the striking thing about this judgment, according to deeds or works, is that John does not mention any among the dead whose works were found acceptable to God. He tells us only that if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, that one was thrown into the lake of fire in verse 15. Oof. His terse language leaves many questions unanswered. Were the martyred saints who reigned 1,000 years the only ones who were redeemed? Did the rest of the dead come to life only to die again in the second death, in the lake of fire? If not, what was the millennium's purpose? Why did we stretch this out another 1,000 years? What about the prophets and saints in the Hebrew Bible? Are they raised to new life in John's scenario? If so, is it before or after the 1,000 years? We just don't know, because John does not answer any of these questions, because he's recording a single vision with a single purpose. He is not providing us in this 21st century Western civilization a blueprint for the human history of salvation. His emphasis is on judgment here, not salvation. Those whose names are not written in the book of life will not live. They will die forever in the lake of fire. John has already told us who they are: the inhabitants of the earth who worshipped the beast and the dragon, according to chapter 13, verse 8, and chapter 17, verse 8. Now, what the beast and the false prophet and the dragon are in the lake of fire, and their followers must inevitably join them. For John, it's as simple as that. Yet even the second death, or the lake of fire, in verse 14, I know it sounds awful, but let's see if it has a positive side. I know. Try to look for the positive, right? It is not made first for human beings, rather for supernatural entities and institutions that oppress human beings. Babylon implicitly, chapter 17, verse 16, chapter 18, verses 9 and 10, and chapter 19, verse 3, and the beast, and the false prophet, and the dragon explicitly. It is as Jesus said, then he will say to those at his left hand, you who are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. That's from Matthew 25, verse 41. More importantly, the lake of fire swallows up death and Hades. See also Isaiah 25, verse 8, and 1 Corinthians 15, verse 54. After the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the death that were in them, and after the dead were judged, says John, death and Hades will be thrown into the lake of fire. This is all very confusing, isn't it? Especially for modern Christians who were taught that Hades is the biblical word for hell. Well, okay, we're going to see here King James Version, which I don't advocate, but it says death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. And that hell in the book of Revelation is itself the lake of fire. How can hell be thrown into hell? The 18th century Welsh hymn writer, William Williams, captured the meaning in the third verse of a great hymn called Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah. Let me share that third verse with you. When I tread the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fears subside. Death of death and hell's destruction, land me safe on Canaan's side. Quite a few hymns, unable to make sense of William's bold imagery, substituted, changed it, quite a few hymnals changed it, to say, bear me through the swelling current for the third line, death of death and hell's destruction. Changed it to bear me through the swelling current. Williams himself saw clearly that the death of death and hell's destruction, described in Revelation 20 verse 14 is what opens the way for new life and salvation in chapter 21. The confusion stems from the fact that Hades is not hell, as understood in the Christian tradition of our modern era. Rather, it should be considered the grave, which corresponds more to the Jewish idea of Sheol in the Hebrew Bible. It is never mentioned by itself in the book of Revelation, rather only as the companion of death. See example chapter 6 verse 8, death and Hades. When John says that death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, he means the graves were opened and the dead were raised. This is the language of resurrection. We could call it the second resurrection, if you like, corresponding to the first resurrection of verse 6. So instead of the second resurrection, he calls it the second death, verse 14, for two reasons, perhaps. First, because his emphasis is not on being raised to life, rather than on being raised to die again in the lake of fire. And second, because it is the death of death itself, and of death's grim companion, the grave. So the notion that death and the grave are thrown into the lake of fire characterizes the lake here not as a place of torment. Contrast that with chapter 19 verse 21 and chapter 20 verse 10, but rather as a place of destruction or non-existence. Death and Hades are not tortured or punished. They simply cease to exist. The message here is a vivid scene, and it's a simple one. There will be no more death. Chapter 21, verse 4. In Paul's words, death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? See 1 Corinthians 15, verses 54 and 55. The way is cleared now for the triumphant visions of chapters 21 and 22. So I'm going to stop there. It's a good stopping place before we begin chapter 21. And if you want to be prepared for the next video next week, if you haven't already, you may want to, go ahead and read chapter 21 and chapter 22, perhaps take them together. You can read them separately if you want, whatever you're best for you. Or if you're me and you like to listen to the verses being read while you look at them, I enjoy playing a dramatized version of the chapters, and it's just got some great sound effects that goes along with it and some different voices for the different angels and things like that. I just prefer it. So thanks again for joining me this week. If you happen to be in the Sun City Center area and you want to join us in person, we worship at 10 a.m. on Sundays. If you can't join us in person at 10 a.m. and you want to watch us on our live stream, we broadcast the live stream at the same time, 10 a.m. on Sundays. But then it is added as a recording. If you want to watch it later in the week, you can do that as well. Again, thank you for joining me here again this week. I hope you're having a blessed week. Take care, and God bless.